before sunrise, the front line outside Kupiansk was quiet in a way that made soldiers uneasy. Russian spotting drones had been circling all night, scanning for any sign of movement, any sign that Ukrainian forces were preparing something unusual. But for once, there was nothing to see. Ukraine wasn't massing tanks. They weren't preparing a standard push. They were waiting for something new to arrive, something they had trained for in complete secrecy. And when the moment finally came, it looked like the battlefield shifted all at once. The first sound Russian units heard wasn't the roar of engines or the crack of rifles. It was a deep, controlled thump in the distance. A single shot, then another, then a perfect rhythm. French-made artillery, newer than anything Ukraine had used before, had just entered the war zone. And it didn't come quietly. For months, Ukraine had relied heavily on a patchwork of artillery from different NATO countries. Powerful, but inconsistent. Some systems were older. Others required constant repairs, and ammunition types varied. It created delays. But the new French systems, along with their advanced rounds, were designed to work fast. They could fire, relocate, and fire again before Russia could even lock onto their position. Ukraine had trained small teams for this moment. Their instructors drilled them not just in firing the weapons, but in understanding how they fit into a larger picture. Timing mattered. Coordination mattered. The goal wasn't to fire the most. The goal was to fire exactly what was needed at exactly the right second. And when the first mission began, the teams performed like they had been doing it for years. Russian trenches were hit first, not with random bombardment, but with precise, targeted shots that hit command posts, communication cables, observation points, and key firing positions. The accuracy stunned Russian soldiers. They had grown used to Ukraine's old artillery patterns, predictable, slower, easier to counter. But this was different. These shots landed with alarming precision, seconds apart, each one aimed at weakening their structure instead of overwhelming it. Within the first hour, Ukrainian infantry commanders reported something unexpected. Russian radio traffic was chaotic. Officers were shouting over each other, trying to understand how Ukrainian forces had suddenly gained such range and accuracy. At the same time, Russian artillery crews were trying to respond, but they were already too late. Every time a Russian battery prepared to fire, a French system was already adjusting to hit them first. The turning point came when Ukraine used a new type of ammunition provided alongside the artillery. These rounds didn't simply explode on impact. They sensed movement. When they detonated above a position, they scattered a precise pattern of fragments downward, hitting equipment and exposed soldiers while minimizing waste. They were designed for open trenches, artillery pits, and lightly armored vehicles. Exactly the type of targets Russia had been relying on. Meanwhile, on the Ukrainian side, the new systems were performing even better than expected. Their mobility allowed crews to relocate after every few shots, leaving Russian radar scanning empty fields, while Ukrainian guns were already kilometers away. Drone operators coordinated each strike in real time, creating a chain of fire that looked almost choreographed. Ukrainian soldiers on the ground described it as a moment when everything finally clicked. The training, the waiting, the frustration, the losses. They had a tool that could match and even surpass what Russia had been using. As Ukrainian infantry advanced through damaged Russian positions, they found something surprising. Many Russian troops had abandoned their posts quickly, leaving behind broken equipment, scattered ammunition, and incomplete defensive plans. It was the clearest signal of how hard the French artillery hit them, not just physically, but psychologically. By the end of the day, Ukraine had retaken several kilometers of territory that Russia had spent weeks fortifying. Analysts studying satellite images noticed the same pattern. Impact zones lined up perfectly with Ukrainian objectives, showing an operation that was not only well executed, but scientifically precise. Russia responded with predictable fury. State media described the artillery as a threat to strategic stability. Military bloggers blamed bureaucracy, corruption, and poor leadership, and senior officers demanded immediate reinforcements. But nothing could hide the fact that one thing had become undeniable. Ukraine had just executed one of its cleanest breakthroughs of the war, and it was powered by French technology. This first phase of the operation left a clear message on both sides. For Ukraine, it showed what they could accomplish with modern, coordinated artillery. For Russia, it was a harsh preview of what might come next. Because the breakthrough was only the beginning, the real goal was still ahead, and the next 24 hours would reveal whether Ukraine could turn a successful strike into something even bigger. As evening fell across the battlefield, Ukrainian commanders were already preparing the next phase of their operation. The breakthrough created by the French artillery wasn't just a tactical win. It opened a corridor, one that Ukrainian forces had been studying for weeks. But to exploit it, they needed the new artillery systems to keep performing flawlessly. And so far, they were exceeding every expectation. After the breakthrough, Russia attempted to stabilize the front by throwing in reserve troops and redeploying artillery units from nearby sectors. But this reaction created exactly the pattern Ukraine hoped for. When Russia began moving large groups at predictable hours, Ukrainian drones tracked every truck and armored carrier. The French artillery teams received updated coordinates, and within minutes, the new fire missions began. Unlike older systems, the French cannons could calculate firing solutions faster than Russian units expected. Every time Russia tried to regroup, they were met with another wave of precision strikes. It created a rhythm that Russian troops couldn't escape. Move, get spotted, get hit. The mobility of the artillery meant Ukrainian crews could fire from locations Russia didn't expect, forcing them to waste ammunition on empty patches of land. One of the most significant advantages came from the new guidance systems integrated into the artillery. They worked seamlessly with Ukrainian surveillance drones, allowing for adjustments mid-strike. Russian crews reported shells landing unusually close to their positions every time they tried to set up. This forced them to abandon well-prepared firing sites and rely on improvised positions that offered almost no protection. Meanwhile, Ukrainian infantry units began pushing deeper through the corridor. They were careful. Every meter had to be checked for mines or traps, but the pace was faster than anyone predicted. Russian troops left behind equipment, maps, and even personal belongings. Some positions showed signs of panic evacuations. Russia's defensive system, usually rigid and heavily layered, looked suddenly fragile. Russian commanders tried to regain initiative by launching counter-battery strikes. But every attempt was met with the same problem. Ukrainian gunners were too fast. They fired, relocated, and fired again from a new angle. By the time Russian radar detected the firing location, the artillery team was already gone. It became clear that Russia's traditional tactics, overwhelm the enemy with volume, weren't working against a system designed to outthink and outrun them. What truly shocked Russian analysts was how efficiently Ukraine combined the French artillery with their existing equipment. Older Ukrainian guns weren't replaced. They were integrated. The new systems targeted leadership nodes, artillery pits, and concentrations of troops. The older guns then blanketed the retreat routes, creating a layered assault that Russia wasn't ready for. It was no longer about single systems. It was about synergy. As night battles intensified, Ukraine used another advantage: thermal imaging. The French systems came with advanced sighting equipment, giving Ukrainian crews perfect visibility, even in complete darkness. Russian units had to rely on older optics and inconsistent night vision gear, putting them at a constant disadvantage. Ukrainian fire missions remained accurate long after sunset, while Russian responses became increasingly erratic. By the second night, the scale of Russia's problem became undeniable. Their lines weren't just breached, they were destabilizing. Communications were delayed, reinforcement orders were confusing, and some units had moved so quickly that they no longer knew the location of neighboring troops. Ukraine exploited every gap, sending small, fast-moving teams to secure key intersections and disrupt logistics. The psychological impact grew with each hour. Russian military bloggers described the French systems as invisible predators, firing before anyone realized their positions. Soldiers complained that the shells seemed to curve mid-air, hitting targets they believed were safe. These weren't supernatural claims. They were the result of a well-coordinated modern artillery system operating with real-time intelligence. By the third day, Ukraine achieved what many analysts had doubted was possible: a complete collapse of a Russian defensive sector. Not a temporary retreat, not a staged withdrawal, a collapse. Dozens of defensive structures were abandoned. Entire trenches were empty. Some units retreated so quickly they left their heavy equipment behind, choosing mobility over armor. With the French artillery still supporting the advance, Ukrainian forces solidified control of newly captured ground, restored communication lines, and pushed forward reconnaissance units to assess the next potential breakthrough. This wasn't a symbolic win. It was a strategic one, a clear demonstration that modern Western artillery, when used properly, could reshape the battlefield. Russian leadership reacted with anger. Statements accused France of direct participation. State media claimed the artillery was part of a NATO mission. But no matter how loudly they protested, one fact remained: Ukraine now had a tool that could challenge Russian firepower head-on. And Russia had no immediate answer. In the final hours of the operation, Ukrainian commanders reviewed the results. The breakthrough was wider than expected. The enemy losses were larger than predicted. And the morale boost for Ukrainian troops was enormous. The French artillery had done more than destroy targets. It changed the tempo of the war, at least in this sector. And it signaled that with the right support, Ukraine's momentum could shift again. For Russia, the message was clear. A new era of artillery warfare had arrived, and it wasn't in their favor.